It's Game Boy World, and this is arcade classic Space Invaders. If you're watching this video, I should think you need no introduction to Space Invaders. Tomohiro Nishikaido's 1978 arcade classic helped launch the Japanese games industry and became a global pop culture phenomenon in itself. But let's imagine you wandered into this video series by mistake. First, thanks for joining us. I hope you like puzzle games. Second, let me explain Space Invaders. It's the primal arcade shoot-'em-up, pitting a single player with a single gun against an encroaching army of hostile alien invaders. The player defends the bottom of the screen against the advancing enemy forces, which move in a rigid formation from top to bottom. If even a single alien reaches the ground, the player loses. The aliens shuffle back and forth across the screen, reversing direction while advancing a single row downward once the leading column of creatures hits the boundary of the screen. Their movements are accompanied by an inexorable martial beat, which increases its tempo as the invaders do. The invaders drop bombs and lasers toward the player in an erratic, unpredictable fashion. In turn, you can only fire a single missile at a time toward them. By modern standards, it's a slow and methodical, and above all, limited shooter. But it works. There's strategy to the game. Do you thin the enemy ranks by shaving away the lower portions of the formation? Or do you try to take out the leading columns so that they have further to crawl across the screen before ratcheting down a level closer to their goal? You had PONG in 1972, which involved two players bouncing a projectile back and forth. 1976's BREAKOUT turned PONG sideways and replaced the second player with a wall of bricks to be smashed. Space Invaders simply extended that evolution a little further, converting the passive obstacles of BREAKOUT into active, hostile threats. It was the logical next step in game design, and it laid the groundwork for the shooter genre as we know it. So here we are, more than a decade later, and Space Invaders appears on Game Boy. Makes sense, the original version of the game had even lower color bit depth than Game Boy, existing in stark black and white. The Game Boy was almost too powerful to play host to Space Invaders. Its two intermediate shades of gray were completely wasted here. And, not surprisingly, Space Invaders plays quite faithfully on Game Boy. Admittedly, this is no arcade-perfect port. Even for a work of this vintage, some compromises had to be made to fit Space Invaders onto Game Boy. For starters, the striking white-on-black visuals of the arcade original had to be surrendered here due to the limitations of the Game Boy screen. I've captured the video on Super Game Boy using the device's single reverse color palette, which was also seen in Solar Striker. And, just as in Solar Striker, Space Invaders inverts the traditional color scheme of space games as a matter of necessity. While it would have been technically possible to keep the invaders light against the pitch black of space on Game Boy, doing so would have made the game much more difficult, maybe even impossible. The Game Boy's cheap, passive matrix LCD screen causes heavy ghosting as dark objects leave behind a trail that fades slowly when they move. The invaders do it here, being dark objects in a light background, which creates a sort of speed effect that makes the game look a little more visually interesting than it actually was. That's fine when the dark color data is applied to small objects, but if you were to reverse it, the ghosting effect would obscure the invaders. Once the last few survivors of a formation accelerate, they might even become impossible to see. The ghosting effect that trails behind the invaders now would trail behind space, as it were, and each light-colored invader would be muted for a few frames as the passive LCD crystals faded from the black of outer space to the colorlessness of the invaders. Anyway, that's strictly a cosmetic change for this version. The other compromise here on Game Boy has a little more impact on the game itself. The Game Boy's resolution, as ever, is entirely too small to properly reproduce the full arcade game pixel for pixel. The classic machine used the 8-bit standard vertical resolution of 224 by 256, like an NES or Super NES flipped sideways. And as we've seen with NES to Game Boy conversions, the move down to Game Boy's 160 by 144 resolution necessitated some reconsideration. Given that the entire point of Space Invaders is to make use of the full screen, the invaders start at the top, move to the bottom, and shuffle from left to right, retaining faithful pixel art for the in-game objects and moving to a scrolling design would have been both stupid and game-breaking. Instead, Taito compressed everything into a single Game Boy screen. The invaders themselves have been very slightly redrawn to be smaller. The tiny squid aliens in the top two rows are largely untouched, while the crab and octopus monsters that comprise the lower ranks are more compact, yet nevertheless recognizable. The space between rows is also highly compressed. If the invader formation were a paragraph of 12-point type, their leading would have been reduced from 24 in the arcade to 14 points at home. The amount by which the invaders descend upon hitting a wall has been adjusted accordingly too. So, fundamentally, the pacing and action remain pretty much true to the arcade game. Significantly though, the invasion now consists of 8 columns rather than 11. meaning there are 40 aliens to shoot down instead of the arcade's 55. This is an interesting and intelligent design choice. While there's certainly room for the full host of 11 columns with these resized sprites, it would have meant pushing the columns together, and that would have resulted in an unacceptable compromise to the gameplay. A big part of what makes Space Invaders challenging comes from the limitations of the player's offensive force. Your missile base can only fire one projectile at a time, and your rate of fire is not determined by an internal constraint, but rather by the presence of your artillery on screen. You can't fire until your previous projectile has left the screen, whether by striking an object or making its way off the top edge. If you sit and shoot at the shields directly above your ship, you can maintain a rapid rate of fire, at least until your shield wears away. On the other hand, if you fire and miss, you're left helpless until your poorly placed shot flies off into space. So, the gaps between the invaders' columns have material impact on the way Space Invaders plays. It's essential for them to leave some room for your wild shots to drift past, rendering you unable to retaliate. The risk-reward resulting from the need to aim carefully and place your shots is essential to Space Invaders. Thoughtful design choices like this make Space Invaders about as good a port of the game to Game Boy as you could possibly hope for. There are some fundamental differences unique to this port. Projectiles fly more slowly and everything seems slightly more sluggish, perhaps to allow the pacing to feel consistent with the arcade despite the smaller playing field. Still, even small details, like the specific behavior that results from projectile collisions, feels consistent with the arcade original. Strangely though, this version never left Japan. Despite the global popularity of Space Invaders, America wouldn't see the classic on Game Boy for another 4 years. 1994's international version of Space Invaders is essentially identical to 1990's Japan-only release in some ways, and it's the most incredible and technically stunning Game Boy release ever in others. When played on Game Boy, 1994's port of Space Invaders appears to be completely identical to the 1990 release. The visuals look the same, the timing works the same, the music sounds the same. But then you plug it into a Super Game Boy. We haven't really talked much about the Super Game Boy here on Game Boy World. It wasn't launched until 1994, so it's a ways out for this chronological project. But without it, this entire project wouldn't even be possible. The Super Game Boy was, essentially, Game Boy hardware housed in a special Super NES cartridge, and its video signal output to television rather than to an integral screen. It compensated for that aforementioned difference in screen resolution between the two systems by adding a number of special exterior frames as a screen border, rather than stretching Game Boy's graphics to a different, non-integer size. Super Game Boy also allowed the use of custom color palettes, 24 in total. For older games, it could simply assign a given color to one of the 4 shades of gray, but Game Boy software designed specifically with Super Game Boy enhancements in mind could feature unique frames and even color palettes that broke the innate rules of the Game Boy. Space Invaders 94 is one such game. The standard game mode uses a custom color palette to allow you to simulate 3 of the original arcade renditions of Space Invaders. You can play in black and white, with color overlays, or with a full color screen. The overlay mode reflects the fact that the original Space Invaders used colored bands of acetate or cellophane on its screen to cause the white Space Invader sprites to change hues depending on their location on screen. As the aliens descended, they'd pass through different bands of color. While the sprites themselves remain unchanged in game code, the screen overlay would lend the illusion of a color game. You can also play in full color mode, which essentially is 1979's Space Invaders 2, aka DELUXE Space Invaders. In this version, the cellophane overlays were replaced by full color sprites. While the effect on the sprites was largely similar, they changed based on their proximity to the ground rather than possessing specific hues of their own. The Super Game Boy rendition draws a distinction between this and the overlay mode by rendering the background solid black rather than dividing it into slightly colored bands. Yes, that's right. On Super Game Boy, Space Invaders undoes the inverted color of the standard Game Boy mode. Since this mode would only be played on a television, Taito's engineers didn't have to worry about LCD ghosting. Interestingly, if you apply a standard Super Game Boy color palette to the game, it reverts to the inverted colors of the basic Game Boy edition, even in overlay mode. The Super Game Boy enhancements are only available if you let it boot into its default style. Color mode features one other element to distinguish it from overlay mode. When you die, all white elements, that's invaders, shields, your missile base, and the score, flash momentarily red. All in all, the Super Game Boy mode makes for a pretty sweet improvement over the original handheld release of Space Invaders, especially with the awesome special custom Super Game Boy frame designed to resemble the silkscreen frame around the arcade cabinet's monitor. But all of that is pretty much par for the course for Super Game Boy enhancements. What really sets the 1994 release apart is the arcade mode. If you choose the second main menu option, Space Invaders fades to black and reboots as something radically different. In fact, it's so different it's not even a Game Boy game anymore. As explained by game developer and Game Boy superfan Christine Love on her blog, the arcade mode of Space Invaders 94 is a full-on Super NES game. Apparently, it turns out, the Super Game Boy had the ability to allow Game Boy software to reboot and launch into actual Super NES code. Space Invaders arcade mode is a legit Super NES game, all the way down to the region locking. The European cart can't boot on an American Super NES, and vice versa. As for a Japanese version, well, there was no Japanese version. In fact, the reason that the Super NES version of Space Invaders was so good is that Taito had actually already released it, sans GB component, in a standalone Super Famicom cart a few months before the Game Boy version debuted in the West. Basically, the Super Game Boy enhanced Space Invaders that came to America and Europe in 1994 combined Japan's 1990 Game Boy Space Invaders and 1994 Super Famicom Space Invaders into a single Game Boy cart. This has the bizarre side effect of meaning that the most impressive and mind-bending Game Boy creation ever didn't actually show up in the country that created Space Invaders, and Game Boy, and Super NES, and Super Game Boy. And that's a shame because this is an amazing piece of work. By freeing itself of the limitations of the Game Boy's Z80 processor, arcade mode offers a damn good imitation of the coin-op Space Invaders. Much of the content is carried over from the standard Super Game Boy mode. In addition to the 3 modes of that version, there's also a stark black and white mode designed to imitate the Space Invaders cocktail cabinet. But in every case, the execution is far more impressive than it was with the basic Super Game Boy mode. For starters, while the pixel resolution isn't 100% accurate, it's 256 by 224 pixels rather than 224 by 256. Super NES Space Invaders captures the speed and feel of the arcade far more effectively. It features the full army of 55 invaders, moving at a more rapid clip than on Game Boy, with exchange projectiles screaming along at high speeds. Your missiles take the same length of time to reach the top of the screen in arcade mode as in standard Game Boy mode. But since it's covering the full screen and thus more pixels in arcade mode though, it feels like it's moving more quickly and makes the action seem more intense. And again, each of the game modes, besides the stark black and white of the cocktail mode, looks far more impressive in arcade than in its equivalent Super Game Boy version. For instance, the original arcade format uses the Super NES's alpha transparencies to great effect. Some versions of the Space Invaders coin-op used a mirror projection system to cast an image of the screen graphics onto the monitor, which was actually just a pane of glass. This allowed the alien horde to appear as if it were descending over a lunar landscape. The Super NES Space Invaders sets the invaders to be partially transparent over top of a reproduction of that background, which nicely creates an illusion that beautifully simulates the images created by those old arcade cabinets. Meanwhile, the cellophane mode reproduces the banding effect that's seen in the Super Game Boy mode, but here it uses the Super NES's higher resolution and color depth to imitate the minor imperfections that would appear at the edges of the cellophane on the old cabinets. Where colors abut, the graphic designers have created the impression of overlapping layers of cellophane. And finally, and somewhat least impressively, the full color mode offers the cocktail version of the game with color. Oh well. And of course, in all modes, the Super NES version offers pretty accurate audio, seemingly sampled straight from the coin-op. It certainly sounds a lot more like the real thing than the well-meaning but sadly puny effects of the Game Boy edition. But really, this is an incredible package because it offers it all. Game Boy, Super Game Boy, Super NES, Space Invaders 94 offers what was easily the finest home conversion of the arcade classic at the time. And incredibly, it does it with a hidden feature inside a Game Boy cartridge. This was surely Nintendo's grand vision for Super Game Boy, portable games that did their best, which could then be plugged into a console for a better, higher fidelity experience. Sadly though, this is the only instance of that ever happening, probably because it was kind of pointless. I mean, who even knew about this feature? And who cared when it was squandered on a port of a 16-year-old arcade game back before much of anyone cared about game history or revisiting the medium's roots? It was a brave and brilliant effort, but one frankly wasted. Eventually, Taito decided to be a little less clever about the whole thing and released the standalone Super NES version of the game in both America and Europe in 1997. I can't imagine a lot of people bought a nearly 20-year-old game on an obsolete system at that point, but who knows? For some reason, a ton of classic arcade ports hit Super NES at the end of its life. Not just Space Invaders, but also Arkanoid, Frogger, Mr. Do, and even a couple of Atari and Williams anthologies. So maybe there was something to it. In any case, 1990's Space Invaders for Game Boy was a pretty solid port for Japanese audiences, but it was nothing compared to the incredible reissue we received here in the US a few years later. Thanks to Taito's madly ambitious, hardware-bending treatment of its landmark classic, this is a double dose of video game history, and an absolute essential for any Game Boy collection. For hundreds of games nowhere near as incredible as this, keep reading GameBoyWorld.com. This project is supported through Patreon.com and through the sales of the Game Boy World 1989 book on Amazon.com. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel, and join us next time as we ask the ultimate existential question: are you ready for some football?